Got a question for you. It's a little bit different than the ones we've been asking to open these scenes and these episodes, but what is your pregame posture? So before you go into a big event, what do you do to prep yourself to get yourself ready for that big moment? Whether it's to get yourself hyped up or get yourself calmed down, what is your pregame posture? We know pregame posturing, pregame preparation, and rituals are important, and they have a direct impact on how somebody performs in big moments, whether it's sports or speaking or uh, in whatever it is that you do. What's up, everybody? I'm Tyson Putoff, and this is scene 13 of the Jesus X30 Challenge. We are traveling scene by scene through the life and campaign of Jesus, following my 3-volume project on Jesus's life and messianic campaign called Jesus, the Strategic Life and Mission of the Messiah and His Movement. 3 volumes. You can get them anywhere in ebook or in print. Grab your copies, follow along. Again, we're in scene 13. So pregame postures, pregame rituals. Everybody has one, and everybody does things a little bit differently, right? So on a football team, you might have the hype guy, the person in the locker room getting everybody up and getting them pumped up, giving the pregame speeches. You might have the headbutter guy going around really physically rocking everybody into readiness for the big game. You also might have the guy over in the corner just kind of calming down and centering himself. Back in my boxing days, I used to try to get away from everything before I stepped into the chaos and the noise and into the storm and into the ring. So I would go and find somewhere far off, and I'm 1,000% introvert, so this kind of makes sense for me anyway. But I'd go off and I would just close my eyes. I'd put some like classical music on my Discman and just try to like bring myself in and calm myself down. And I remember one time before a big fight, I was way off in the tunnel at a big auditorium, and two of the workers at the auditorium came up to me and startled me because they thought I was asleep. My eyes were closed, but that was just how I tried to center myself and get myself ready for a big fight. And we'll talk about that in a minute. So Matthew 8, Luke 6, Mark 4. So in scene 13, we get a glimpse of Jesus's character and his abilities and his identity and his power that we haven't had up to this point in Jesus's public campaign. Okay, this is spring or summer of 28 AD, so he's been public and active and had his group of disciples for about a little over a year. And at this point, though, he's been doing miracles. He's been confronting some opposition, and he's been laying out his constitution for how God's empire, this empire that he's establishing, he wants it to look. But he hasn't really just come out and proven himself in the way that he's going to here in this scene. Here in this scene, we encounter a story that I think is a little bit too familiar to us. We know it as the calming of the storm. And we all know the story from Sunday schools, or even if you didn't grow up in the church circles, you know the story about Jesus going out and calming the storm. But I think it's a little bit too familiar to the point where we lose so much of what is actually taking place in the text and what it actually reveals, not only about Jesus, but about Jesus's impact on our lives as we speak today. So let's walk through the story. Jesus and the disciples get into a boat and they're crossing over the Sea of Galilee, and they're headed to the other side. And it seems like a pretty peaceful and nonchalant trip across the sea. But all of a sudden, midway through their trip, a storm arises. If you're reading the narrative closely, it takes a dark and violent turn at this point, to the point where the gospel writers really struggle to understand and to communicate what's really happening here. And English translations lose some of this, and just our lack of kind of understanding of what these stories actually sounded like and would have been understood as in the ancient world, we lose a lot of what's happening here. So the gospel writers actually describe the sea here as waking up. They're struggling to communicate how severe this storm actually is. It's like the storm wakes up, like going over and poking a lion under a tree sleeping, or a bear walking into his cave and stirring him up. The sea awakes. And then all of a sudden, what we have is this violent storm that's come out of nowhere, and it's literally trying to devour the disciples and Jesus in the boat. It attacks them. It's almost like this living beast has awoken and decided it's time to eat. It's time to come out of hibernation and devour something. And the boat that the disciples and Jesus are in is its target. And not only that, but Matthew himself, he doesn't know how to put into terms just how severe this particular storm is. He comes along and he describes this not as a storm necessarily, but as a megaseismos. He describes it as a great earthquake. And there's no scientific evidence that there was an earthquake or a major earthquake at this time in this region, but Matthew's not speaking meteorologically. He's describing this as something that's beyond a storm that he can even put into words. And so what you've got is this enormous storm that's trying to devour the disciples, and Jesus is in the boat with them. But what's Jesus doing this whole time? He's asleep. So the disciples are in a life or death situation. Jesus is over taking a nap. Eventually, we don't know how long exactly, but Jesus gets up after the disciples prompt him, and he walks over almost passively or casually, it kind of seems like from the text. And he says, "Quiet, be still," and everything stops. The entire storm silences immediately. The clouds dissipate, the thunder stops, the lightning strikes stop, and it's peace. And actually, Matthew kind of parallels megaseismos with a Greek form of great peace. So he says that the storm was a megaseismos, a great earthquake. The peace that we now experience after the storm has silenced, it's a great peace. And the entire time, the disciples are terrified. And so they're terrified for two reasons. Again, they're terrified because of the storm, but you have to understand this was more than a storm. You've heard this explanation, sort of a meteorological phenomenon that happens around the Sea of Galilee. The Sea of Galilee is surrounded by mountains, and this cold air comes rushing off of the mountains and encounters the warm air coming off the lake. And then, there's something about dew points and cloud formation. And all of a sudden, this type of storm is common on the Sea of Galilee and can surprise even the most seasoned of fishermen. You've heard that explained. But the disciples at this point aren't thinking of a meteorological event. They're thinking mythological. They're thinking cosmological. They're thinking theological. So in the ancient world, you have to understand what the sea was. The sea was not just, water. It wasn't just H atoms combining with O atoms and creating H2O, and it was something that you drank and that you swam in and that you enjoyed and that you cooked with and that you washed with. The sea was an actual living entity. It was the manifestation, the body, the physical presence of the most horrific, terrifying deity in all of heaven and earth. That's what the ancient people believed. It was the manifestation of the god of chaos. And so you think of some of the stories in the ancient world. The god of chaos was so challenging and so horrific that before the creator gods in all of these ancient stories in Babylon and Egypt and among the Hittites and in Canaan, before the creator gods could actually take Legos and start piecing things together and creating creation, they had to do one thing, and that was defeat the god or goddess of chaos. They had to tame the sea. They had to put the sea into submission. And that way they could start to build the physical properties of creation. And so you see this in Babylonian creation stories. You see this in Egyptian creation stories. You see this in Hittite creation stories. And you see this in Canaanite creation stories in the land of Canaan where the Israelites settled. And you also see this in the Bible. If you know your Bible well, look at Genesis 1 and you'll see this type of a narrative play out. Before God comes along and is able to start creating things and putting the Lincoln logs together and creating all the physical elements of creation, what's he do? Genesis 1:2. You read, "The Spirit of the Lord is hovering over the deep," tehom. It's this watery, chaotic entity or force that has to first be subdued, submitted before God can start the process of creation. And so when this storm strikes, the disciples are rightly terrified. They're not thinking, oh man, this is a bad storm and meteorological event, so let's just wait it out. They're thinking we're being attacked by a cosmological force that comes along in the form of the sea and tries to devour whatever it wants. But they're not just terrified of the storm, because notice as the storm is, but they're not just terrified of the storm itself and of the sea. Notice that their terror remains even after Jesus puts the storm to rest. So they're terrified of the storm, but they're also terrified of Jesus. Look at their response. And your English translation probably says something like, they respond like, who is this that even the wind and the waves obey him? Mm-mm. They literally say, according to Matthew, what type of being is this that even the wind and the sea submit to him? Okay? So they're not asking about who Jesus is at this point. They've been with him a year. Most of them have. So they know who he is. They're asking what he is. They're literally saying, what the heck is this thing in our boat that even the sea, the forces of chaos, can submit to him? Because they understand that the only being, the only thing, the only what in all of heaven and earth that can put chaos into submission is God himself. And I love this story. I love the end of it. I really get annoyed at the middle of it. The disciples are in a near death situation and they're just hanging on for life. And all along, Jesus is asleep. In 2020, I hit a wall. And I can't really explain it, honestly. I look back at this time from about 2020 to 2023, 2024. So not too long ago, and still lingering on. Things were going well in terms of my career and in my path to answering a call that I had received from God 20, 25 years ago. And that was to do what I'm doing now. But in 2020, something happened. I refer to it as my midlife crisis because I don't know how else to talk about it. But at that point, I was publishing, I had been teaching, I had been making connections, I had received some really lucrative potential jobs in places in the world that would have been absolutely incredible. And I don't know what happened, but something just crashed. And I lost my purpose. I lost my passion. I felt like I was, when you try to start a lawnmower engine, and I would start to come out of this and then just crash even farther over and over and over. And I started having anxiety attacks. And before this, I'm gonna be honest, I didn't know what people meant when they talked about struggling with anxiety on this level. I had dealt with depression and other things, and it was COVID, so I know a lot of you were dealing with difficult circumstances and having difficulties more than what I can actually point to. I used to think having an anxiety attack was something like when, before a boxing match, when your knees get shaky and your heart races and you just have to settle yourself down, but that's not what it is. It felt like something was reaching into my chest and squeezing the oxygen out of it. Like something was reaching into my boat and pulling me down into the water and holding me under. And that happened for several years and still comes and goes. And I can't explain it still why this all happened, but it felt like all along God had put me in a boat and said, let's go to that side, and given me a direction, giving me a purpose. And then all of a sudden he was nowhere to be found. And I found myself in what I feel like was a life or death battle between me and chaos. Tried to continue teaching, tried to continue taking care of my family the best as possible. And it would have been one thing if I had looked up at the front of the boat and I had seen Jesus up there, Leonardo DiCaprio style, king of the world, or up there with his sword slashing the heads off of these waves as they tried to reach into the boat and drag us down into the abyss. That would have been one thing. It would have been great to see, and it would have made going through this period of time a lot more manageable, I think. But what was frustrating to me, and the same thing is frustrating to me about this calming of the storm story is in all of the chaos, in all of the attacks, in all of the unknowns, in the uncertainties, and the difficulties and challenges. I look around for Jesus and I catch him over in the side of the boat, sleeping. That's frustrating, and that's tough to see. But then I remember the rest of the story. See, in the ancient world, before the Creator God went into battle against chaos in this mythological literature in Babylon and Assyria and in Canaan and places like that, or before a king went into battle in the historical literature, they always adopted a pre-game posture, a pre-game set of rituals, a pre-game routine. And do you know what that looked like? It looked like a nap. Before Marduk went to slay Tiamat, the goddess of chaos in the form of the sea, before Baal went in to slay Yam, the god of the sea and chaos, they would take a nap. They would retreat to their palace. They would retreat to their temple. Before a king would go into battle, he would retreat to his palace or his tent. And upon the urging of his people, come out and rescue us. Awake, O king. Awake, O Lord. The king would emerge and be ready to lead his troops to victory in battle. You see this in the Psalms. Awake, arise, O Lord, join us in battle. Come help us defeat our enemies. This has a direct bearing on how we understand the calming of the storm story. Jesus wasn't just asleep because he was indifferent to the disciples' plight. And Jesus isn't just asleep because he doesn't care what you or I are going through. He's not asleep because he has sent you on a path and put you in a direction and called you to a calling and made a promise to you that he's going to see it through. And then all of a sudden, he's nowhere to be found on the boat. Jesus wasn't asleep because he didn't care. Jesus was asleep because he was engaging in a posture of preparation for battle. And I'm telling you today that Jesus is not asleep on you. It may feel like that, because it does for me too sometimes. And I feel like I have to scream at him, arise, awake, O Lord. Come and rescue us from this battle that you've sent me into. And I'm telling you right now that you may feel like that, and I feel like that, and I get it, but Jesus isn't asleep. He's adopting a posture of preparation for battle. And it's just a matter of time before he rises, joins you in the fight, and puts chaos to sleep. Thanks for being here. Come back next time for scene 14 of the JesusX30 Challenge.